Hey, thanks very much for coming. Conflux asked me to talk about rebooting Australian culture after the pandemic, and I think that's a pretty relevant topic in 2022. So today's chat's going to be a little bit of an intro about me, a little bit of a chat about where things have been at in the pandemic, in particular, the depth of the downturn, which has been really significant. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about policy, and it's quite an opportune time to talk about policy because at a federal level at the moment, of course, we've got a new arts minister and a new federal arts policy currently in consultation. And I know some of you have probably even written in some submissions to the federal arts policy, which is great. So I'm going to talk a bit about how we can build back better, basically. How can we tweak the settings? How can we have a much more accommodative, much more generative, much more stimulative cultural policies, particularly at a federal level, so that all Australians can enjoy culture in a much more richer and in a more diverse way, because this stuff's important. So a bit about me. I worked as an arts journalist for many years and still write a little bit around for The Guardian and outlets like that. I also worked as a festival director and a music promoter in the 2000s until I went broke, which was, it was a good time. We had a lot of fun, put on a lot of shows, and eventually racked up a 60 grand credit card debt. Then I went and did my PhD in cultural policy at the University of Western Sydney, where I particularly looked at Australian cultural policy. I studied there at a place called the Institute for Culture and Society in Parramatta, which is a really interesting research centre and kind of is focused on, in particular, cultural studies and some of the kind of more cutting edge kind of understandings, researches into culture and why culture is important and why culture matters to people. So that was great. And these days I work at Monash University in Melbourne, where I'm teaching the Masters of Cultural and Creative Industries there. And I still write around and freelance around and do various things out there in the community. For example, through the first half of the year, I was campaigning for a thing called Fund the Arts. And that was literally a one-issue lobby group where we were campaigning for more funding for the arts. We did a lot of work, a lot of media appearances, and we met with a lot of candidates and Teal independent MPs and Labor and the Greens and pressed the case for more funding for the arts. So I've already sort of given you a quick outline, but let me give you a further quick outline for today. I feel like I'm sort of standing in front of the thing, but I guess I'm not, but because I'm used to lecturing, right, in a little room, so if you stand in front of the screen, the kids can't see it. I don't think it's it won't be any surprise to anyone here that the pandemic was a very significant event for Australian culture. And on some levels, by some measurements, it was the deepest downturn, the deepest contraction in activity since the Second World War. Okay, so a very significant event in Australian culture and global culture, in fact. And the damage was sustained, really deep. I'll show you some slides in a minute that show that we're not back to 2019 yet. We may never, I imagine we will eventually get back to the activity levels of 2019, but we're still a long way away from them. And so many aspects of culture, not just economic either, but social and the kind of human fabric of culture in Australia have yet to recover since the pandemic, and I think that that's really important to note and to point out. And I think that the pandemic also asks us deeper questions about the value of culture and the point of having policies that look to support the arts and culture for ordinary people, for citizens. And I think some of those questions are actually really important questions. They're questions that need to be asked, and they're questions that haven't really been addressed by policymakers and maybe aren't being taken up enough by the cultural sector itself in terms of championing the value of culture, not just to government, but broader community. And I guess if there's a kind of, if there's a through line to my talk today, it would be that return to 2019 is not a viable option. That's not going to be the best road forward, and that actually might be quite damaging. So going back to what certainly was not glory days before the pandemic for the arts and culture is not going to be what will be the best thing either for artists, for the people who are involved in the economic activity of culture, or perhaps most importantly for ordinary citizens who gain so much meaning and so much value from culture. And so what I'm going to be arguing, and what I have been arguing for a long time now, is that we need a large-scale public reinvestment in culture, particularly at a federal level. So we need to spend more public money on culture, and we need to tweak policy settings so that we can have a richer, a more diverse cultural sector so that we can deliver more of the benefits, more of the value, more of the meaning that culture gives ordinary people. And that's going to be what I'm going to be looking at the end of today's talk. So let's look at the downturn. It was pretty bad, and I think it's easy to talk about. Yeah, it was bad. People lost their jobs, but when you look at some of the numbers, they are really quite striking. So some of the sectors really had like complete shutdowns, as we know, performing arts, for example, in Victoria, completely shut down for much of 2 years. And lots of sectors were affected, and some sectors were affected differentially. So even some sectors that you would have thought would not be too exposed to the pandemic, like say literature, actually took a big hit, because it turns out that a lot of the income that writers get actually comes from public events, comes from speaking, writers' festivals, public engagements, panel discussions, things like this. All right, so a lot of income vanished out of the sector, a lot of people lost their jobs, a lot of revenue disappeared, audiences, well, they didn't go away, but they certainly weren't able to buy tickets. So yeah, let's have a look at a couple of stats. So I'm going to walk over here because it's a bit of a complex graph, but this is from Live Performance Australia data. So it's the kind of gold standard for attendance figures in Australia. And this is basically just the drop-off from 2019 to 2020 by subsector, if you like. And you can see that, well, every single category was dropped by more than half. That's probably the first thing to say. And some sectors dropped by really quite astonishing figures. Negative 83% for ballet. Negative 80% for musical theatre. Negative 79% for comedy. Right? This is ticket revenues, attendances in the purple. Overall, a drop in revenue of 70% and a drop in attendance of 2/3, more than 2/3. That is an incredible downturn. I mean, if you think about what economists call a contraction, in the broader economy, often a deep contraction, a very deep economic contraction might be 5%, it might be negative 10%, right? So this is astonishingly deep contraction in the economic activity of culture. Let's look at cinema. All right, so this is cinema admissions, kind of bumping along at around about 85 million for the decade after 2010. They dropped to less than 30 million in 2020. Once again, they've dropped by 2/3. That's tickets sold to Australian cinemas. Now, this is not news to anyone, I'm sure, right? Like, we all lived through the pandemic. We all were locked down. Certainly most of us in Victoria were. But when you see it on a graph like this, I think, and when you look at the numbers, it gives you a sense of just how damaging, just how severe the economic contraction was. And things haven't recovered yet. Okay, so we're not back to 2019. So This is employment coming out of the ABS. This is ABS labour force data. So it's a little bit choppy, this data, because their survey is big, but it's not big enough probably to, you know, capture all of these little sub-industries like, you know, heritage, publishing, broadcasting, what have you. But you can see that across those industries, these are arts and entertainment industries, so defined by the ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics. We're still 14,000 jobs down on November 2019, okay? So even now, this is the latest data, this is May 2022, right? So, and some significant drops in there, you know, like print and recorded media. Now, some of that is kind of technical, like, you know, print has been in a long-term secular decline for obvious reasons because of the rise of internet. But even so, it's not good, right? And, you know, the creative and performing arts one at the top will be the one that covers most kind of solo artists and probably, you know, creative practitioners. And even though that's 2,000 jobs, 2,100 jobs ahead of November 2019, that's probably below trend, right? So even there, it's nothing to write home about. Bottom line, you know, like things just haven't recovered yet. This is data I got off these guys called Deputy. They're a kind of, I guess like a tech company that does invoicing and HR kind of reconciliation. They're a little bit like Xero, I guess. Anyway, they very generously gave me data earlier in the year tracking arts, entertainment and recreation casual shifts, right? So I'm not privy to the methodology here, but it's interesting. So at least certainly January 2022, I've got to get the later figures from them. It'd be nice to get more up-to-date figures, but you can see that even then, you know, still not back to where we were in 2019. And in fact, the other interesting thing about this is you can see, you know, a pretty clear double dip, and a lot of the data actually shows that so that the rolling lockdowns 2020, 2021 gave us two distinct dips in creative activity through the course of the pandemic, and also that we haven't recovered yet. This is data from UNESCO, so the UN cultural organisation. UNESCO has done a very big report on the global impacts of the pandemic on culture. And you can see that, yeah, it's pretty bad, right? So the size of those circles, sorry, the yellow is a bit hard to read, but the size of those circles show you the size of the reduction in gross value add, which is, again, another economic term. Basically, for the smaller, more defined cultural sector, they say it was -8%. And if you exclude books, press, and audio, visual, and interactive media, the decline was actually 1/4. Now, this is global data, according to UNESCO. So that's very big declines. And, you know, if you compare that to -8% for transport, which was obviously pretty hard hit with aviation. Global GVA reduced by, you know, -3%, which is, you know, that's a global contraction. That's a very severe global contraction. But for the cultural sector, particularly excluding books and internet, to drop by 1/4 across the globe shows you, I think, what a historic event the pandemic was for culture. It was the deepest downturn since the Second World War. So UNESCO says that the global revenue losses for the culture sector during the pandemic were in the range of 1/5 to 2/5. That's 1/5 to 2/5 reductions. And an estimated $750 billion US reduction in gross value added. And UNESCO estimated that 10 million jobs were lost worldwide. So that's pretty bad. Now, if we turn to the policy response, particularly in Australia, I think it's fair to say that Well, I think it's fair to say two things. Firstly, there was a policy response, and that was good. So we did get some support, particularly from Josh Frydenberg's JobKeeper. Also, the Morrison government with Paul Fletcher tipped in an element of stimulus funding, like the RISE program, the so-called Restart Investment for Sustainable something program. Can't remember what the E stands for. Who comes up with these acronyms, right? So $220 million for RISE. That was funding that was tipped into the, particularly to both for-profit and not-for-profit culture, so that was positive. But, and also there was a significant quantum of extra stimulus at state and local government level. So all that was good, but it wasn't enough. In fact, it didn't really touch the sides, I'd argue. You know, so for example, JobKeeper had a number of significant problems, okay? I think that's fair to say. The most obvious was that lots of people weren't eligible for JobKeeper. So JobKeeper was great for the people who got it. Lots of people couldn't get it. If you're a casual employee who had been employed for less than 12 months by the same employer, which is most casual employees, then you couldn't get JobKeeper. If you worked for a university, you couldn't get JobKeeper. And in fact, the Morrison government changed the rules for JobKeeper 3 times to make sure universities weren't able to access JobKeeper. And then we saw universities shed around 35,000 jobs in 2021 as a result of the pandemic, not being able to access federal stimulus. And a lot of those jobs actually did go in cultural type academic roles. So for example, we saw wholesale destruction of entire university art departments. Visual art schools were shut down. At my own university at Monash, the Centre for Theatre and Performance was pretty much killed. A lot of people took redundancies and they smushed it in with the music school, and now there's essentially no theatre and performance at Monash. We saw you know, a theatre school at the University of Newcastle essentially killed off. So these are really, you know, nasty cuts that happened in lots of important institutions in tertiary education. Local government wasn't eligible for JobKeeper. So if you worked in a place like this, for example, you probably weren't eligible for JobKeeper. Lots of regional galleries couldn't get JobKeeper. So patchy, you know, inadequate, didn't really do enough. And I think that's pretty much the take-home message for the stimulus response to the pandemic at a federal level. It just wasn't good enough, right? There was some good bits about it, but it didn't really, it certainly wasn't as big in terms of quantum as the amount of money tipped into aviation, for example. So nowhere near as much money as Alan Joyce got at Qantas. And also patchy, you know, in a nutshell, inadequate. And of course now, the stimulus has ended. So RISE is finishing up, JobKeeper is long ended, and yet, as we've seen, the sector's still not back to what it was before. So, what are the trends at the moment coming out of the pandemic? Are we coming out of the pandemic, by the way? Well, I guess, you know, infections are still with us, but we're certainly not in the kind of crisis levels that we were in 2020. But I think it's fair to say there's still significant COVID transmission in the community, we know that. Some events, some performing arts events are still being cancelled because of COVID infections and COVID events, including, you know, very important performing arts activities, like we've seen cancellations of Hamilton, we've seen cancellations of a number of other performing arts events and festivals, particularly earlier in 2022. That seems to be sort of dying down a bit now, and we do seem to see more performing arts activity, and we're seeing more musicals open, we're seeing more festivals running. The pandemic shock has created major dislocations in the cultural labour force. I think that's, you know, a really important point. So a lot of people have left the sector. A lot of workers have up and left. They're no longer working in these industries. They've gone and found work in other industries, whether that be landscaping, whether that be white collar work, what have you. But this is, we can see this in the stats, but we can also see it anecdotally as well, that, increasingly there's some skills shortages emerging, where we're seeing significant shortages of skilled labour for, crew, AV technicians, festival workers, events workers. Those people who used to work in the industry, they're not there anymore, they're working in other industries. There are some significant labour issues. And of course we know that in the broader labour market, unemployment's now 3% and a bit. So it's a tight labour market. And also, cultural industries don't pay people very well. So it's going to be hard to lure workers back from some of those other industries. So these are significant problems emerging for culture, I think, in the labour market. Many cultural organisations have run down their reserves and they face pretty uncertain futures. So a lot of small to medium companies, just getting by. I feel like a lot of contemporary music venues just hanging on by their fingernails. A lot of festivals, might reopen, may not reopen. And you can see, for example, with the debacle at Splendour in the Grass, that there was a desperation there for that festival to try and get back up on its feet and sell a bunch more tickets than it normally would have, I'm sure, to try and alleviate some of the hit that they'd taken over 2 years. Also, new problems emerging in a complex economy. So supply chains have been disrupted by the war in Europe. We've still got major disruptions in China. We've got really big problems of cost of living. We've got rising energy costs. Rents are skyrocketing, particularly in capital cities. All of this affects culture. And yet, all right, so this is a photo from a wonderful article in the American radio show NPR, American Radio Network, NPR. It's an article about a little dance school in regional Colombia and how, basically these citizens started dancing as a way to get through the pandemic and what that meant to them, why it was so valuable for them. So it's basically about a community dance school, and this is a photo from that. There's no doubt that people embraced culture. Ordinary citizens turned to culture, particularly cultural pursuits, during the pandemic, for solace, for their mental health, to improve their kind of solicitude, to feel better about their lives and themselves. People took up musical instruments or took them up again. People started dancing at home. We saw an explosion in craft work at home. So we saw a really amazing kind of efflorescence of grassroots participation in culture through the pandemic. And I think that was really, really fascinating phenomenon because, all of a sudden, particularly white collar workers, a lot of people were at home, didn't have necessarily have a job to go into. They might have had a job at home on the Zooms. But people had a bit more time to think about their lives. And I think a lot of them, with that extra time and that extra kind of ability to think about what they were doing with their lives, a lot of them turned to culture, embraced art and culture, either once again in their lives or perhaps in a new way for the first time in their lives. And it reminds me of a quote from a pretty interesting thinker who's having a bit of a resurgence, a guy called Ernst Bloch. He was a sort of German Marxist. He wrote a big kind of incoherent book about hope. It's not a very good book, but he's got a lot of really interesting things to say about hope. And Bloch wrote, "Man does not live by bread alone, especially when he doesn't have any." And I think this kind of sums up the importance of culture. Like it is more than bread and butter in a sense, because culture and the arts give us meaning in our lives. They give us value and a sense of personal identity. They kind of are every bit or even more important than the kind of nuts and bolts, bread and butter issues of daily sustenance, of food, clothing, shelter. And you can see that throughout history. Culture helped people get through. So here's a peer-reviewed journal article about the role of music in everyday life during the pandemic. Basically, the conclusion was music helped people feel better. Now, that seems, to be a fairly anodyne or fairly boring kind of observation, but it's proper data, it's psychological, it's a psychology journal. These guys are proper scientists, they've done the stats, it's statistically significant. And I think that it's actually a really quite a deep observation that people turn to, for example, music or singing at home to feel better. Now, what does that say about the value of culture, in terms of maybe there's some reasons why it's important to support culture, particularly for policymakers. All right, so let's assume that we are coming out of the pandemic, perhaps not as quickly as we'd like and certainly not as healthily as we might like, but nonetheless, there's a sort of new landscape kind of becoming visible. What does that landscape look like? Well, I think in terms of economic trends, there's a whole bunch of cross-cutting stuff that's affecting the future shape of culture economically, and I've sort of given you a grab bag of those. I'm not going to talk too much about them, but it's a little bit technical, but what the non-neoclassical micro-foundations of culture, basically, what I mean by that is that cultural industries are not like what economists think industries are meant to be like, right? They have non-rational consumers. They also have non-rational workers. So workers will work for free, which is not what economists think workers should be doing. But also consumers can be completely irrational too. And anyone who's sort of seen a very hot ticket or seen the sort of the fascination that artists will have for fans will know that consumers are often not rational in their decisions. So culture kind of questions a lot of the kind of neoclassical foundations to equilibrium and rational buyers and sellers in a marketplace. And that's interesting, I think. Platforms continue to dominate particularly large-scale international culture, particularly tradable culture. And that's not going away. In fact, it's going to get worse. So platforms are going to get bigger and they're going to get more dominant, and that's going to continue to squeeze money out of the rest of culture. So you'll get a structure, or perhaps we've always had a structure of big oligopolies or even monopolies surrounded by a dense undergrowth of small to medium firms who are providing services into those platforms. Culture has a complex political economy. That's because artists make symbols, and symbols can affect the way people think and vote. So the political economy of culture is inescapable. Culture is, amongst other things, it's woke, it's liberatory, it's about telling people about a better world. It is about hope. It's also highly critical of power structures. So culture has an inherently political aspect to it, which you cannot escape and will continue to be incredibly important in the way we understand this type of activity. Culture can also be, in many respects, a luxury. So even though, man doesn't live by bread alone, it's also the case that going to the opera is expensive, right? Owning visual art is expensive. So culture has some uncomfortable connections with inequality and with the tendency for high-priced luxury goods to be used by very wealthy people to signal their status, and that causes all sorts of problems for the structure of these industries, and particularly for the remuneration of artists. Labour in these industries is a perennial problem, okay? So workers in culture are typically precariously employed or even not employed at all, simply gig workers. They often suffer from tremendous income insecurity. There is massive income and wealth inequality in the cultural labour market. In fact, the term superstar economics was originally coined to describe cultural labour markets. And so that is how things have been for a very long time, particularly in Western cultural industries. But something's changing. Workers are now organising. They're starting to join unions again. They're starting to demand better wages and conditions. We've got a strike on at Reading's bookstore in Melbourne at the moment, for example, because the workers in that bookstore are demanding higher wages and better conditions. We've got a strike at 9 Fairfax at the moment. Same thing, right? We're starting to see a change in these cultural labour markets where artists and cultural workers are demanding a better deal. And I think that's a really interesting economic trend. And of course, allied to that is that audiences are becoming more empowered too. And they're demanding a better style of content. They're demanding more diversity. They're demanding, that the content that's served up to them involve them as human beings and speak to their own cultural, social, and political priorities. And that's also causing difficulties for cultural industries. And social trends are obviously affecting these places too, these sectors too. So society is becoming more diverse, and so are audiences. And this is feeding into that empowered audiences kind of trend that I was talking about. Politics is becoming more polarised, including becoming more polarised by platforms. Inequality is rising. Social dislocation is rising with it. The world is on fire. We have an environmental crisis. And so there's a whole bunch of socio-political destabilisation. Look at the contemporary United States. And that's paradoxically feeding into a whole bunch of really interesting art. So there's this amazing art being made in Australia, particularly by First Nations artists at the moment, that's questioning Australia's whole history as an extractive settler colony. I'm thinking about art by people like Megan Cope, for example. Right? So there's some fantastic, really interesting, kind of really subversive art that's feeding into some of these bigger debates, and it's being driven by these socio-economic trends. But the policy landscape hasn't kept up. Right? So policy makers are still trapped in a neoliberal mind frame, particularly at federal level, and I include the Labor government in that. While most of us would be pretty keen to see the end of neoliberalism and would be keen to see a very different approach to the way policy is done, I think a lot of policy makers, politicians and bureaucrats are still trapped in the assumptions that they learned at university, and they're still trapped in a very 90s, early 2000s kind of mindset. Deregulation, corporations are better than public organisations, privatisation is a good policy, markets are good at distributing resources, these kind of assumptions that we know now kind of aren't true. Austerity, luckily, I think, I would have said it was over, but I guess we'll see after Jim Chalmers' new budget. But I feel like JobKeeper and the pandemic kind of smashed the idea that balanced budgets were the measure of economic policy. And I don't think that idea is coming back. The pandemic also showed us that public policy, public programs, public and collective responses could be actual solutions to complex problems. That's very interesting. For 20, 30, 40 years, we were told that markets were the solution to complex problems. But actually markets can't solve a problem like a pandemic. They can't solve a problem like a major public health crisis. They also can't solve problems of culture because culture is inherently public as well. I would say policymakers are at least 20 years behind where they need to be in terms of understanding the new landscape that confronts us all. This is the Lismore City Library after the flood. All right, see all those books there? That's books from the Lismore Library. Climate change is going to affect culture very, very significantly. It's going to destroy cultural infrastructure. It's going to make many of our existing cultural investments risky or even destroy them altogether. And of course, it's only going to get worse. There is essentially no public policy to deal with the climate change mitigation as it affects culture in this country, right? It's too hard. We haven't done it, right? There's very little work being done by, say, state government bureaucrats to work out what will happen to their beautiful public buildings and institutions in the centre of their cities if they were faced with a climate catastrophe, an extreme weather event. And yet it's happening already. So, all of this is to say that I think that we can't go back to 2019 policy settings. It's not going to work. In fact, if we were to go back to 2019 policy settings, that would be a bad thing because 2019 wasn't great for culture, okay? 2019 was 10 years of public austerity at federal level. It was artists with some of the lowest wages of any workers in the economy. It was massive inequality, insecurity and precarity. It was underfunded institutions, and it was citizens who were fundamentally sold short of what should be their patrimony in a very rich country. It got to the stage in 2021 where the National Archives ran a crowdfunding campaign to safeguard priceless artefacts. Not just artefacts, you know, that were like important, but like literally the records of the Australian government going back decades, because they hadn't been funded properly by the Morrison government. So we need a large-scale public reinvestment in culture, and we need it for us. We need it for citizens. Not for artists, although they certainly need a better deal, but for us as citizens, because we live in a democracy, and as voters, as people who live in a democracy, we have the right to expect a rich and diverse and meaningful cultural life. So here's 4 things that I think should be done. And these are the things that I've told the government in my submission to their national cultural policy. And I know, I'm sure they won't be reading it too carefully because they've had about 5,000, but you know, this is what I think. So I'm not going to go over it in too much detail, but I'm going to try and whip through a few of these ideas, but also want to give up some time for questions as well. So firstly, First Nations must come first. Right, I think that's fundamental, and I don't think that there's much debate about that, but there's also not enough follow through at the policy level of actually making that happen. And I say that as a white settler. We need more funding, much more funding, and it needs to be targeted at the right areas. We badly need to improve the income and security of artists and cultural workers. That's probably the most glaring problem for culture in Australia. And finally, we've got to tweak the policy settings to safeguard local content, especially, because increasingly, in a globalised, platformised world, Australian content is disappearing off those platforms. So very quickly, I'll just try and, I don't want to whip through this, but I'm sort of running out of time because I've talked too slowly. First Nations first, right? So white settler excuses are no longer enough. You know, we need to put First Nations artists and curators in charge of policy, give them the funding and the resources, and give them the autonomy to make the right calls. And where that happens, we'll get some amazing outcomes. There's lots more I could say about this. We need much more public reinvestment, right? So I'm not saying it's investment, I'm saying it's reinvestment, because we used to have much more than we do now. For example, in the Whitlam years. So most importantly, I think we need more funding for artists and small to medium organisations, small to medium institutions, grassroots cultural activity. We've got to have more arts education, right? There's a crisis in arts education in our schools because our public schools are not funded properly enough, and because the national curriculum it doesn't stress it. Well, arts education is in the national curriculum, but many schools just don't have the resources to do proper arts education, especially in the public schools. Here's one that's close to my heart. I think the government should fund 300 creative fellowships annually. These are properly paid above median wage, fortnightly salaries that go for 3 years to artists, to make art, to be artists. Currently, the Australia Council does 8. All right? It's a risible figure. So there should be 900 of these, basically on a rolling 3-year basis. And that, I think, would be transformative for the mid-tier of Australian culture, because all of a sudden, you could get someone like Megan Cope, could get a 3-year job to be an artist. I think that would be amazing. The Australia Council should run it. We should triple the small to medium funding. It goes without saying. We need a new publicly owned streaming platform. Okay, so it should roll in ABC iView and SBS On Demand and a lot of the work that the public institutions do in terms of their digital repertoire. There should be a big investment in that, cultural capital investment. And then there should be funding for content on that platform as well. We badly need to improve the income and security of artists and cultural workers. Right? So the government needs to intervene in the cultural labour market, which is broken, in order to legislate for better security for artists in particular and cultural workers. And there's an opportunity there, because Tony Burke is also the employment minister, and he's very interested in more security for workers in general. So here's a real chance, I hope. We've got to safeguard local content, right? So Australian repertoire on Netflix is about 2 to 3%. Recently, on at least by one measure, there was no Australian content on Disney Plus at all. None. 0. Okay? There should be a 25% rule that means that any platform on any technology has 25% Australian content. And if you can't get the Australian content onto your platform, you have to pay a tax. And the tax goes to a content production fund that would then pay for Australian production. Okay? This is an old idea. It was first raised by the Convergence Review in 2011. Never done. We also need a better definition of what is Australian content, and I argue we could copy the Canadians there, who do a good job. So the summary of it is, we can have nice things, right? Australia is a rich country. The Australian federal budget is $500 billion annually. The kind of investment that I'm talking about is around about 2% of that figure. So we need to up Australian cultural funding, you know, and even that would only take us into the mid-tier of OECD countries in terms of, you know, national funding devoted to culture. So we can afford it. I argue we should do it because culture means so much to ordinary people, and there's an opportunity for the government to do it. But will they? That, I think, will be determined by us as citizens, as members of cultural communities. If we go out and we campaign for it, we may well get some policy reform. That's it. Taylor said we couldn't have nice things, remember, but I disagree with Taylor.
Great, thank you, Ben.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, that was some great insights there on where we've been, where we're going, and some good suggestions as well. Thank you. Now I'd like to open up to the audience. Do we have any questions? Over here.
Thanks, Ben. I thought that was spot on, that survey. That's pretty much where I sit with you too. I just want to talk about just institutions for a moment. It's my feeling at the moment is that organisations, arts and cultural organisations, small, medium, large, are probably in a worse position now than they were a year ago. And it's kind of a dirty secret. Because, you know, a year ago, organisations of all kinds and all sectors were very public about their fragility, and we all understood why. Now, for all the reasons you said, JobKeeper, various special COVID monies from federal and state no longer available, huge skills and labour shortages in the sector, you know, theatre shows can't find stage managers, film sets can't find crew, like reserves down. And I know that a lot of leaders of a lot of cultural organisations around Australia have been knocking on the door of the federal arts minister and the state arts ministers saying, look, we don't want to be public about this, but we're on the verge of insolvency within 6 months, unless something happens and we don't know what to do. I know that a lot of organisations have been delivering that message directly to various cultural ministers, federal and state. So it feels like there's the potential in 6 months or a year that a lot of organisations which are very well known, small, medium and large in Australia, will no longer exist unless there's the change of the kind that you're inviting. Can you see much possibility for some sort of significant intervention in how we deal with these things?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm pretty pessimistic on that one. I don't think the sector, unfortunately, has done the hard yards to actually get itself together, to organise collectively, to provide, you know, that kind of public advocacy that needs to happen to drag the politicians to the realisation of the crisis. And I think the slow motion kind of thing that you describe is part of the problem there. So, you know, everybody else is like, oh, we're out of the pandemic now, you know, we can fly on planes, it's great, you know. But of course, you know, for all those things that you say, you know, there's so many institutions, they ran down all their reserves, they're just hanging on by their fingernails. Activity's not back to 2019 levels. Things are very risky and choppy. There's a cost of living crisis. So yeah, things are bad, and I don't think they're getting better anytime soon. And the problem is that the arts sector doesn't have a strong lobby. It doesn't have a very organised collective voice. And so, you know, I don't think that message is getting out there. So there's a lot of work to be done, I think, by leaders within the sector to get more vocal and to get more organised and to do that kind of work. But of course, people are also exhausted, right? And, you know, so there's been a real human toll to the pandemic as well. So I get it, you know. Yeah, it's a real conundrum.
In the middle, up the back.
Do you also sort of see there's a change geographically where activity is happening because I guess our city centres are not what they used to be. The level of I guess return to work isn't where it used to be. So all of that stuff is shifting as well. So you know, there's models and frameworks that are not going to work anymore for blockbuster shows, etc.
Yes, is the short answer. So I'm doing a project for the City of Melbourne at the moment, sort of looking at kind of local government settings for those guys for coming out of the pandemic. And yeah, like there's no doubt, the inner city of Melbourne is not back, the CBD is not back. It may never come back in the way that it was. But I also see that as an opportunity because, you know, if you got a scenario where there might be some cheap rent become available, or where we look to different uses for our urban footprints, so they weren't just devoted to kind of 9-to-5 office culture, with some nighttime economy sort of sitting over the top of that after dark. But if you look to re-energise planning kind of frameworks into sort of, you know, daytime cultural activity, I think that's a potential possibility. But there's also a regional kind of thing going on. So we've obviously seen a lot of people move out to the regions during the pandemic. Will they stay? I think that's an interesting question. As long as they do, then that's a huge opportunity for regional centres like Bendigo. So I'm pretty bullish about regional cities and culture over the next 10 years because they're affordable to live in, or certainly slightly more affordable, slightly less prohibitive, perhaps is a better way of describing it. And also there is infrastructure in some of these places, like this beautiful theatre here, that could be taken up and could be used. So I think it's, you know, positives and negatives, you know, opportunities as well as threats. So you know, I think that there's a complex story yet to play out there.
And a bit further forward. Yep.
Hi, that was great, thank you. When you talk about our cultural policies and government being 20 years behind where we need to be, can you talk a little bit about whether or not you can see a path to us getting where we need to be and what that might look like? Or are we just going to stay 20 years behind where we need to be?
We need a long march through the cultural institutions, particularly, and government agencies as well. So we need to wrest back some of that policy power from those central agencies of government like Treasury, Finance, the central departments of Prime Minister and Premier and Cabinet, because those policy people are the ones still thinking 20 years ago, right? And I really see this with Chalmers, who's a smart guy, but his policy mindset seems to have been formed very much in the kind of early 2000s kind of framework. So we need to be working much harder to lobby people about, more innovative, more interesting, more public, more democratic solutions to cultural problems. And, we need to be stressing the subsidiarity of policy. So saying, we are the people who this policies affect. You need to talk to us because it's important to us and we have answers that you don't have. So there's a lot of work that's got to be done, I think, both as ordinary citizens, but also the sector's got to get more organised in terms of how it presents ideas. And, just to take one example, one thing that the entire cultural sector's got to stop doing is it's got to stop talking about the economic impact of culture, right? Because that's a losing argument and has been losing for 20 years. And I still hear cultural leaders say it all the time. You've got to fund culture because there's 300,000 people employed by culture. It's such a big industry. It's bigger than mining, right? Those arguments haven't won. They haven't won for 2 decades. They're not going to win in the future, right? The reason to fund culture is because it's meaningful to us as human beings. Those are the reasons why we should be arguing for changes in the cultural framework, policy framework.
That's perfect because that's sort of, I'm interested in finding out your opinion on culture's relationship to health and education. Now, as we know, those particular sectors are also in crisis, but there's also a very strong relationship, and that I feel could be further developed as an argument.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're human beings. We obviously need resources in order to live, but we also need care, and we need to educate ourselves, and we need to be looked after when we're sick, and also we need to express ourselves culturally and artistically. So, culture is not part of the care economy. Culture is its own thing, and we should support culture for its own reasons, in and of its own value. I'm very strong that the real value for culture is cultural value. It's not because culture makes people healthier or better at school, right? There are reasons to support culture that are inherent to culture itself, but in terms of thinking about our policy landscape and the kind of big picture decisions that governments make, it's pretty clear that the kind of economy and society that we've set up in 2022 is not working for maybe the majority of citizens, okay? So if we start from that basis point, then I think that opens up a lot of space to talk about different policy settings for culture as well as for social priorities as well.
Can I piggyback on that?
Yes, you can.
Which people touched on kind of different ways of articulating value. As you say, I could entirely agree about moving beyond the economic argument and being more specific about the kind of inherent value argument. But in your view, is there anything to learn from the kind of advocacy and value discussions of other sectors? Like I'm thinking sport, for example, like the way that sport, speaks to community involvement, the way that sport kind of speaks to participation, the way that it involves kind of grassroots, the whole of life cycle. I think are there any interesting models from other sectors that you would tap into?
Yeah, I mean, people always talk about sport, and I obviously think sport has a lot to teach all of us about advocating for getting public money, because sports are really good at that. But I also think that we should look outside of sport. So I think that maybe an interesting model to look at is some of the work of the economist Mariana Mazzucato and her work on big challenges, right? So like the idea of big public investments in trying to solve complex problems. You know, she looked at examples like, you know, moonshots, like the US moonshot of the 60s. You know, if you set a priority, if you put the resources of government behind it, if you use the levers that are available to policymakers, all sorts of things can happen. And I think advocacy needs to be looking at a bigger picture than simply, you know, this stuff's great, and it's don't just, you know, like we've got a sporting stadium, so now we need a performing arts centre. Like, and I know that's not what you're saying, but you know, I think sometimes culture gets caught up in thinking, oh, well, you know, football gets so much support. Why don't we get support like football? You know, I think we actually have a lot more to offer than that. So.
One of the reasons why we don't get the support that football gets is because we don't talk about our own value in as persuasive terms as football does.
I 100% agree with that, yeah. So one thing that sport's excellent at is selling itself in its own terms, in its own value. So you never hear the AFL guys or the sport guys say, we should support AFL because it employs 640 footballers every year, right? That's not what they say. They say, you should support AFL because this is who we are. We're Victorians. We love sport. I've got a scarf that my grandfather gave me, and you know, it's got the blood of Jack Dyer on it, you know, and you know, so they talk in passionate, emotional, symbolic terms, and that's why those arguments are successful.
Anyone else? Up the back, in the middle.
Mine was just more of a comment, and thank you, about when you talk about arts education and bringing that into primary and secondary schools. This morning in discussion I was in, we were talking about bringing the creative arts education into early education, like starting it earlier. And so then thinking about this week what's happened with the early childhood educators being on strike and talking about them wanting to be rolled into the whole public school system as part of that. I just wanted to, if you can include that would be great.
Yeah, we should do it. You know, absolutely. So, I mean, arts education is a really interesting one because it's in the national curriculum. Like the framework is there, the curriculum is fine. There's not the resources to do it properly. And I'd argue that's the same problem with early childhood education, right? Well, because in our country, we've decided that early childhood education is for-profit childcare, not early childhood education that's valuable for our whole community and should be supported accordingly. And that's why you've got early childhood educators who are being paid at the same level as retail workers, right? Which, you know, I also think retail workers should get paid more, by the way, as well. But you know, we've got highly trained educators with degrees in early childhood education who are taking home 30 grand a year. You know, it's not sustainable, and that's why they can't get enough workers. So these are exactly the sort of challenges that, you know, face ourselves as a community, really, because for a very long time we haven't really addressed these problems, and now they're coming home to roost.
Down the front here.
Is that working? It just occurs to me that what we've had even in 2019 is a distribution issue, just in terms of, say, the three levels of government. I remember back in 2013 when there was a similar kind of the Creative Nation National Cultural Policy in development. It was very clear that then the Ministry for the Arts, or the Office for the Arts there, was very concerned about its relationships, interdepartmental relationships at that particular level, and there seemed to be a few steps in that particular direction to start forming some of those buddy relationships with the health and education, etc., etc. Now, it occurs to me that the framework that's being offered at the moment for the National Cultural Policy is very much in that cultural area and at risk of being sidelined. And I'm just wondering, Ben, if you actually have any insights into whether the Office of the Arts is actually having those cross-government, departmental conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably not. You know, but I don't have any special insight into Tony Burke's office. You know, there is a problem with the portfolio structure that you've identified. absolutely. So some of my colleagues, like Justin O'Connor at the University of South Australia, and Tully Barnett at Flinders University, they've argued that we need a bigger ministry, like we need a ministry of culture, right? So it's got to be bigger than just the arts, right? Because so many aspects of government policy touch on this stuff. Copyright laws and attorney generals, you know, communications has got ABC and Screen Australia, you know, all this stuff that is actually really important should probably be best fitted into a Department of Culture, but that won't necessarily solve the bigger picture, which is we don't have a whole of government culture policy, so we need one of them too. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done.
Any other questions? No, that's it. All right, join me in thanking Ben Eltham. Thank you very much, Ben.
Hey, and thanks for the questions too. Those were some really good questions.
Yeah.